All right. So we are here today with Dr. Cynthia Young. Dr. Young is the head of the African American Studies Department and an associate professor of African American Studies and English at Penn State University. Dr. Young received her PhD in American Studies from Yale University and is also the author of Soul Power, Culture, Radicalism, and the Making of a U.S. Third World Left. Welcome, Dr. Young.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. All right. So before we get started talking about kind of what's going on, could you just give us a little bit of background about yourself and kind of how you initially got interested in politics and just how that interest might have evolved as time went on?
Okay, sure. Well, let's see. I grew up in a very small suburban town in Ohio. And so part of, and it was predominantly Jewish, so that meant that grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So I always had a sense growing up of kind of world politics and how politics impact lives, impact families, etc. And then I was one of very few black people in the school, and so that was another way in which I sort of thought through questions around desegregation, etc. So I would say that I've probably always been interested in politics and questions of justice, just more generally. And then I went to Columbia for my undergrad degree. So I was in New York City, and it was the late 80s. It was a time of incredible transition in the city. And so going from a really tiny town to a big city, I think again also just raised all these questions for me around politics. I was actually an English major as an undergrad and then went on to do American Studies. So I feel like the slow movement towards history and politics has kind of happened over time, just as my interests have sort of taken me in different directions.
Okay, very cool. So going back to Ohio, how do you think that, where did you kind of learn about African American history specifically? Okay. Particularly from the perspective of you being one of the few black students in your elementary, middle school, and high schools. Do you remember how they talked about African American history? Did you learn a lot from your home and from your parents? And
right.
Can you kind of go into that?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is I learned very, very little in my schooling. It was sort of like the typical, during Black History Month, there would be a day on Martin Luther King Jr. They didn't really teach us about anybody else. And then in my American history class, there was a week on the civil rights movement, that kind of thing. So I would say that probably I didn't learn very much, but I was always a voracious reader.
Okay.
And my parents, so my mom is white, my dad is black, and so a lot of what I just learned was hearing stories about, they got together before miscegenation and interracial marriage was legal, and so just hearing about their experiences, the kind of discrimination they faced, the fact that they were, involved, as many people were, in, marching when the occasion came up. They weren't marchers, but, they would say, we marched with Martin Luther King when he came to Cleveland, that kind of thing. So, so I think that's where I got a sense of it, but really, it was going to college and realizing how much I didn't know, and then teaching myself that really kind of began that for me.
So is there one book specifically that you think had a particular impact on you?
Oh yeah. So I would have to say Audre Lorde's Sami,
okay.
A biomythography, which is, she was a black lesbian who was an immigrant who was involved in all these different political movements over, the course of her life. And I just remember reading it, and it was really kind of the first time where it felt like someone was really speaking to my experience when she sort of talked about that it was okay to be uncomfortable, that discomfort was good, that that's the way that you grew, that not fitting in was actually an advantage rather than a disadvantage. I think when you're a child, you want to fit in. And so if you're not the majority, you're always thinking about the fact that you don't fit in and how can you fit in and so on. And so that was really the first time where I just was reading something and I was like, okay, that's a whole other way of thinking about this stuff. So yeah, I would have to say that was the book.
Very cool, very cool. All right, so bringing us back to today, Obviously, Donald Trump is now president, I'm sure you're aware of. And basically no one expected that result to occur. So, with that in mind, many of Donald Trump's supporters expressed high levels of racial resentment in various surveys. And a lot of Trump's core platform initiatives consisted of policies that were largely had largely strong racial aspects to them. However, a lot of the media narrative has been competing between a social and cultural kind of a view of Trump's victory and then an economic one. So with that in mind, how do you view Trump's victory? Do you view one side or the other as dominant? And also, do you view them as intertwined in any way?
Yeah. I guess what I would say is I think they're wholly intertwined, and I think it's sort of impossible to tease them apart. I think, there are a couple things I would say. If you think about one of the big surprises, I think, coming out of the election, beyond the fact that he won, was that white women voted for him, in the majority. And that was actually no different than any other election. I think what made it different was the fact that there was the video where he talked about grabbing women's, genitals. There